When we look at the usage of satellites when it comes to telecommunications, data, and transfer of information, satellites only hold about 5% of these communications, right? The rest you actually find or is transferred through undersea water cables. When it comes to deploying satellites above the earth, right, you can deploy satellites in three types of orbit. The first one is known as LEO, the second one is known as MEO, and the third one is known as GEO. These three acronyms basically stand for, when we look at LEO, it stands for lower Earth orbit, right? When we look at MEO, it stands medium Earth orbit. And we look at GEO, it stands for geostationary Earth orbit. The lower Earth orbit starts at about 500 kilometers above the surface of the Earth, and it stretches to about 2,000 kilometers above the Earth. In this orbit, right, this is where you find the International Space Station, right? You also find satellites that are focused or specialized in imaging, right? Scientific purposes, and you find satellites that specialize in telecommunications. In this Earth orbit, thousands of smaller, cheaper satellites can be placed and used in this orbit. Now, in this lower Earth orbit, this is where you find Elon Musk's Starlink constellation of satellites. This is also where you find Jeff Bezos' what is called Kuiper project, right? You also can find satellites that come from a company known as OneWeb, which has been funded by the billionaire Richard Branson. Medium Earth orbit sits at between 2,000 kilometers from the surface of the Earth to about 36,000 kilometers. This is where you find a phenomenon known as the Van Allen radiation belt, right? Now, satellites that you use in this orbit, right, need something known as satellite shielding to protect it from the radiation that comes from a very high charged particles that release radiation. The typical satellite that you find in this medium Earth orbit, right, range from satellites that are used for space science and research, land surveying, right, and navigation, particularly GPS. This particular orbit is able to produce low latency transfer of communication and data. Now, the satellites that you find here, right, are the ones that give access to remote areas, right? Cruise ships, jumbo jets, and it is particularly used for military purposes. So, the medium Earth orbit belt, if I may call it that, basically here you don't need to use as much satellites, right, that you would need in a lower Earth orbit. In lower Earth orbit, right, you would need to use about, let's say, 200 satellites to transfer information, right? But in the medium Earth orbit, you can put in about half of that, right? So if you put 100 satellites in a medium Earth orbit, right, it has the same effect as putting 200 satellites in lower Earth orbit. The geostationary Earth orbit sits at about 35,785 kilometers above the Earth. This is where you find two types of geosatellites, right? The first one is known as the geostationary satellites, and the second one is known as the geosynchronous satellites. Now, when we speak of a geostationary satellite, right, we speak of a satellite that remains in the exact same place, particularly parked over the equator. Now, when we speak of a geosynchronous satellite, right, we speak of a satellite that is in sync with the rotation of the Earth. Now, this orbit provides satellites that can basically provide a planet-wide coverage of the planet, right? And it is believed there is about three types of, not three types, but three satellites that you find here.